Guangsu Province, hundreds of thousands of great mountains and dense forests, which are shrouded in the blue of the blue sky and cotton clouds. In these mountains, deep in their convolutions, the Guangmian cult is located. The temple is made of wood and has a white facade. The roof of the temple is covered with red tiles. There are several golden dragons on the roof of the temple. There are several carvings on the facade of the temple. Unusual creatures with their vicious demonic art live there. Each of them had a special power. A healthy man with brindle-colored hair possessed the magic of either fire or lightning. His eyes radiated rage, and his jaw distorted in a grimace of anger. The totem animal, as it became immediately clear, is a white tiger. His sister was thin and tall, but like him, she possessed magic. With the help of a fan, she controlled the cold, which helped her fight enemies and kill wanderers who took a wrong turn. The little brother was the craziest of all. His yellow eyes always looked straight. His love for killing exceeded the level of his relatives. With his sharp knife, he mocked the victims, receiving pleasure invisible to anyone. Among the mortal people they were called mysterious demon worshippers. They must be destroyed. These are the forces of the rebellion, so kill them all, said the strange man. A bunch of warriors with axes, mosques, sticks and spears were moving towards him, simply not previously visible. They were rapidly approaching the mysterious silhouette, which stood calmly and did not move. In his hands were strangely shaped knives. He continued his monologue, and in the center of the Guangmian cult, standing still and calling on the dark forces, he said, "I am." Purple and black lightning began to envelop his thin body and long arms, raising the wind stronger than usual. Mortals had never seen such wind in the mountains. "I will punish every rebel," he said calmly, but loudly. The guy has long, black hair that falls to his shoulders. His dark eyes are set deep in their sockets, and his thin nose blends smoothly into his forehead. He also has expressive eyebrows that converge in the center, giving him an even more menacing appearance. Dressed in black clothing, consisting of a long cloak that falls to his feet and pants that fit tightly around his legs. He also wears black boots. At that moment, more than 100 warriors rushed at him, risking their lives. The demon, without thinking twice, directed all the concentrated magic at them, without moving even a millimeter. He, directing the magic, spoke words that had long been memorized. The strongest martial artist who was able to master the supreme art of the demon lord. His magic began to gather into a kind of cocoon, which very quickly began to take the form of a demon, angry and hungry. His eyes moved on autopilot, and his hands reached out to the poor people who would soon die. The warriors with their weapons ready were dumbfounded by what they saw. They knew his power and strength, but they did not expect that everything would be so terrible. The monster, summoned by the boy, pointed its spikes directly at the warriors and daredevils. Long and purple spikes cut, pierced, chopped off parts of the body of each person, a stranger. They had no way to survive. Even if they tried to escape, the deadly spikes would catch up with anyone, anywhere. The strangers call this place, the guy continued to speak, holding a bloody knife in his hands, a demonic cult. The warrior, proudly pronouncing these words, stood on the corpses of the dead brave men. His hands, clothes, shoes were covered in blood, but this only made him happy. He liked suffering, blood, pain. If they reached the central plains, the world would plunge into chaos like never before. I, Yenshanik, the first son of the head of the Murim Union, guide the warriors on the true path, said the young man. He has long, black hair that falls to his shoulders. He is dressed in a blue kimono that covers his toned body. Also wears sandals. His look is serious and calm. He continued to say, "Congratulations on completing your solitary practice." A new group of warriors, kneeling, loudly shouted words of gratitude to their teacher. They were ready to go into battle, to defend their land from monsters. They were taught not to be afraid. The teacher continued to speak his monologue. "Since I am there, young master," he said loudly. The warriors stood there with their heads bowed. The guy heard his words repeated, "Young master." He turned around and stood in a stupor. Standing in front of him was himself, only transparent. This silhouette repeated every movement, every word and every facial expression of the real teacher. There was a beautiful house in the village. It is surrounded by a low fence, and you can reach the entrance through curly steps. Sakura trees added color to the landscape and fit into the overall picture of the warrior village. There, at the top, right under the roof, there was a table and chair that resembled a small and modest throne. An old man sat on it, holding a fan in his hands. In front of him, on one knee, the warrior stood, saluting the main teacher for all the knowledge they had received. The only one who looked into the old man's eyes was Jan Kagak. He held the bar the longest, showing his superiority over other warriors. He had the nickname 10 Strikes Star. He was nicknamed so for his ability to withstand any fighting technique in just 19 exchanges of blows. After every victory in every fight, he began to boast of the title of the most skilled martial artist. All his opponents lay out after the fight, thereby increasing Ian's pride. At that time, the political situation within the Murim cult was like the calm before the storm. The desire of people to take the place of the next head increased the intensity of internal conflicts and endless conspiracies. Outside these domains and unrest, there was a unification of cults that deviated from the accepted teachings and began to call themselves the Association of Apostates. They were ready to do anything to get rid of the main heir of everyone and everything. The team included both girls and men who worked undercover and found out all the information they needed. Their goal was finally accomplished. While drinking tea, Yang felt a strange stirring within himself. Dropping the cup from his hands, he grabbed his throat, choking. All the people who were in the tavern jumped up to their future king, grabbing him by the arms, knocking him on the back, and giving him water. In simple words, they tried to save. Unfortunately, Jan Kagak was involved in this wave of political upheavals. After all, he was poisoned before he even reached 30 years of age. A guy was lying on the cold concrete floor. His arms were spread out shoulder-width apart, and his face was covered by the dark hood of his cloak. He didn't move and didn't try to get up for the first 5 minutes. The face was distorted by a grimace of pain and despair. And then he showed signs of life. He began to move and a sharp pain pierced his head. Ugh! The only thing he could say. Every movement was given with great difficulty and pain throughout the body. After looking around the room, he screamed loudly. The guy realized that he was in a place unfamiliar to him. His face became surprised and the pain that was there before simply evaporated. The guy still continued to lie in place, asking a bunch of questions. Where am I? Is this? Why? And everything like that. Pulling himself together, he stood up and sat down. His head started spinning, so he decided to sit back and come to his senses a little. The guy continued to look around the room and remember where he could be. He held his stomach, still feeling the pain from the poison that had entered his body. The face showed pain again. He began to remember and talk to himself. I didn't die from poison? This is a dream. He remained in shock and could not understand what had happened. What kind of place is this and how did he end up here? The guy began to try to get to his feet, but he was again overcome by pain. He knelt down and prepared to give back whatever he could, but instead he just started talking to himself again. I thought I was definitely going to die, but, he said, holding his head, was I kidnapped? Well, at least I'm alive. Looking around him again, it dawned on him. The walls of the room are made of brick and painted black. The main feature is luminous spheres. Glowing balls. Judging by the fact that the walls are simply strewn with these spheres, I was kidnapped by a rather rich and influential organization, he thought out loud. The Ziegel clan? Manhwa clan? Or an association of apostates? The circle of suspects who could have pulled this off is quite wide. You can't even count the possible kidnappers on all your fingers. If you think about how chaotic the political regime is now, it's not at all surprising that someone wanted to harm me, the first son of the head of the Murim Union. He was still able to get up and approach the ledge in the wall, which resembled a door. The entrance is completely blocked, he said with disappointment, touching the wall. He lowered his hand and began to look carefully at the wall. A lot of thoughts were swarming in his head on how to get out of here. Now his eyes were golden and his skin pale, like a vampire from existing legends. The guy decided to inspect the room again. Who knows where, that is, there is a secret room and thanks to it he will get out of this room. Near the wall, his eyes noticed a large bag of strange balls. Interest took over and I approached him. The young man sat down on his knee and picked up the strange contents of the bag. Grain balls, he thought, feeling their consistency on his rough hands. This is the ration used during the training of techniques. This should be enough for several years. He, feeling a hunger that he had never seen before, began to stuff these balls of dry rations into himself and think, there is enough air passing through the cracks of the stone walls. So they are not going to kill me? The guy rose to his feet, looking ahead. If this is so, then they will release me at the time they need. We need to focus on recovery, he continued talking to himself. Only this saved him from the general madness within 4 stone walls. The guy sat in the lotus position. The lotus pose, Padmasana, is one of the main asanas in yoga, requiring significant flexibility and strength in the legs. It is performed with both legs bent at the knees and raised up, and the feet placed on the thighs. Outside the lotus is often used for meditation as it stabilizes the body and mind. Having freed himself from personal thoughts about the past life, he began to meditate and said, I will begin to circulate my chi. Then, realizing the whole problem and remembering that reincarnation exists in the world. His head was filled with evil thoughts. I will make you regret leaving me, Yana Chagak, alive. At this moment, his eyes turned fiery red. The face, thin and gray, began to radiate direct aggression and all the pain that he held within himself and felt during his slow death. I promise, he said even more rudely than before. He still continued to sit in the same position, examining the walls. He was surprised by the fact that there were no water stains on the walls, that is, water did not flow here, but the air was humid. Like this? Then he again felt a cutting pain in his stomach. He closed his eyes, gritting his teeth in the hope that the pain would go away and would no longer bother his body and brain. Consequences of the poison? The guy asked himself, some strange feeling? He still continued to hold his stomach. He heard a strange sound and turned his head towards its source. A fountain of clear water appeared before his eyes. First I'll quench my thirst, he thought. The fountain is round and it is made of stone. In the center of the fountain there is a bowl from which a stream of water flows. The stream of water rises up and falls down, creating a beautiful picture. A fountain can symbolize life, movement and change. A stream of water can symbolize the energy and strength of life. Trees and flowers can symbolize the beauty of nature and its cycle. The guy quickly ran to the fountain and immediately put his hands into the cold water. He began to drink it, wash his face, and simply hold his long hands in the coveted coolness. After planting, he decided to look at himself, hoping that he didn't look so bad. And then he, remaining in place and in deep shock, looked at his reflection. It wasn't him in front of him. His brown hair turned jet black. The eyes were no longer blue, they turned brown. The clothes were completely different, not the ones in which he died. He tried to feel himself in the reflection of the water, try to fight back or something. His face took on even more pain and surprise. He just stood there in a stupor. Out of emotion, he simply fell into this fountain. This sound spread like a moon across the room, and the guy screamed loudly in surprise. Now he can examine himself better. Now he is wearing a burgundy shirt and black jeans. He now has long, dark hair that falls to his shoulders. He has dark eyes and expressive eyebrows. He has a thin face with clear features. He stood in complete shock. Now he didn't understand what was happening at all. He is not him. At one point he just started getting angry and shouting, "My face, who is this?" The guy was angry because he didn't understand what the fuck was going on. Having calmed down, he began to examine his nose. The guy felt himself, thinking out loud, these features. Am I a man or a woman? He had seen a lot in his life, but he could not understand who he was now. And then he realized how you can still find out who he is, a girl or a guy. Yes, he was confused by his own thoughts, but there was no other option. He, wondering if this was possible, began to move his pants in the groin area. These thoughts made him even more sick. He had never done this before, but now he was just suffering from bullshit. And then we will see what is cherished, he said out loud. Phew, I'm still a man. But in this situation, something else surprised him, the size of what he used to test his gender identity. With even more shock on his face, he said, "Damn huge." Well, I remembered the whole essence of the problem, he quickly said. No, now is not the time for this. There are more complicated problems. Sitting on his knees again, he thought to himself, this is definitely not my body. The internal energy is too impure. I don't feel anywhere up to my own art, which I have studied for many, many years. Then whose body is this? With these words, he put his hand to his stomach again. I felt a strange tingling on the tufts of my fingers. In this zone, a strange energy began to accumulate in him, which gave him strength and confidence. He sat and thought. Without someone's help, he will not be able to cope with this situation, understand where he is, who he is or what he is. Within 10 minutes, he finally gave up and said in his head, "No matter how much you think about it now, I won't get an answer." All his thoughts finally converged on one thing: although a little exaggerated, I, who is called the most skilled martial artist, have never been in such a state of loss as I am now. He no longer freaked out, sat calmly, thought about the subsequent possible scenarios of his new life. Finally, he came to a common denominator and realized the sadness of the situation. The voice said, knowing that no one would hear him, "I need to pull myself together. Even if this energy is vicious, it is still there in this body, which means I need to master it and learn use it for your own benefit." The guy got up and began to walk around the wall in the hope that he would find a secret door. He spoke to himself again, thinking and selecting the outcome of events for this situation, the reasons that forced him to end up in this basement room. If I wasn't kidnapped, my mind ended up in the body of someone who was now undergoing a solitary practice. He didn't calm down. For him it was all part of his constant practices and battles that there should have been some clues left, for example, my real body. Realizing that he was feeling pretty good now, he began to gradually move around the room, examining the walls, looking for some clues, answers, or a solution to his problem. He walked just a couple of meters and saw drawings on the rock. They personified different types of martial arts and techniques. He realized that he had wandered to the right place, the heart of the cave, and a possible place for solving his questions of the mind. He noticed to himself that these drawings on the rocks would have looked like scratches about a couple of centuries ago. Thanks to his ability to decipher the rest, I could. A little, of course, but at least something. So these are the arts that the owner of the body studied. Look at the drawings, Yang said, examining them carefully. It didn't take him very long to realize that the designs for this technique were so vicious and strange that he and his loyal warriors had never studied them. Automatically he began to repeat the body movements from the drawings step by step. He wondered who invented it, how strange and amazing they were for his worldview. He repeated, now slowly, now quickly, the feeling of pleasure and peace. He further wondered who could have come up with them. At first his thoughts fell on Dharma, but then he quickly moved away from this thought, since for him it was too vicious. A little tired, Ian stopped and began to think out loud. Even though it was too vicious, he had never encountered such a great martial art like this. His excitement and self-esteem could not stop him from learning it. Still, finally tired, he decided to come closer and read the inscriptions. Death and rebirth. You can only become stronger by being exposed to danger. This seems to be written by the owner of the body as a last resort. Strong words for me. He read this and thought about the words. He said, "This man died from excess chi." He directed energy along the wrong flow of the body. He needed to follow the source and control it until the energy took root in him. While training the drain on the image, he interpreted everything based only on common sense, and not on any other practice. While saying all this, it dawned on him, he was mistaken. The owner of the body and the founder of this skill was mistaken. This art strives for the destruction of all living things, but for peace and grace. Yang realized what to call this technique, Heaven's Uprising. Although proud, it truly deserves to be called an art that defies even the heavens. After these words, energy began to flow through his body. He felt it, he felt how it filled him and gave him previously invisible strength. Yang felt that thanks to her he could destroy all life on earth. The coolest thing about this is that he liked these thoughts. For the first time in his life, he wanted to punish everyone and everything for their mistakes. Thanks to these thoughts, he rejoiced, felt needed and powerful. He soared in the air, feeling in every part of his body a new force for him. Ian decided for himself that she would serve him. Every day the grains in the bag began to disappear. To be precise, there are almost none left. The number of grains has noticeably decreased, said Ian, looking terrible, since during this time in the fireplace room he had grown a beard. At least several years must have passed, the guy concluded. He had long ago taken off his cloak, leaving him in only a burgundy shirt and black pants. He pulled his hair into a small invisible ponytail at the back of his head to make it easier to practice his new martial art. After all this time, he could finally say that he had learned everything that was shown on the wall. Every movement of the legs and arms of the body and every word is written in ancient handwriting. But unfortunately or fortunately, the drawings end in the 10th star pose. That is, there is no need to study further, since there is simply no information. It's a pity that I couldn't master it, but by simply studying everything before, I had already transcended the powers of my past life and achieved an irreversible transition to a new stage. I don't need this last movement that much, Yang said, raising his hands up. His eyes took on a fiery passion. During all this time, he acquired chi equal to 240 years of practice, so being imprisoned here was a blessing for him. Otherwise, God's gift. He thought for a long time before saying this. So student, I have never had the opportunity to express my due respect, so I thank you for your wisdom. I swear that I will not stray from the path of justice with your teachings, he said, bowing in front of the wall. He sat in a meditation pose and thoughts from his past life began to visit him again. My father ruled the world of Muramon. I was confident that I could do more. I can say the same about the art of the senior monks, but this is an unknown art. This is something that I could not have happened if I spent my entire life practicing past techniques. He returned to his own again and was glad that he was able to master such an individual and unusual technique. He suddenly stood up and knelt down and said at the top of his voice, "So I promise to serve the one who created this art hundreds of years ago as my only and true master." For him, these words were special because he could not always say them to his past teachers. As a person walking the path of justice, even if the heavens fall and the earth shakes, my decision will never change, Yang further vowed. This was probably done in vain, since we do not know what will happen tomorrow, what political situation will occur in our world again. The last thing he said before he left was, "I Jan Kagak take my oath. Throw on your cloak," and realizing the significance of the situation, he slowly walked away from the wall using a technique that he had been studying for a very long time. He approached a ledge in the wall where there had probably once been a door. Oh, there's still no hint of how to open it, he thought. Remembering what he had been doing all these few years, the guy decided to open the door with the help of the arts that he had studied. "Then I'll take care of it myself," he said, closing his eyes and concentrating on the energy flowing through his body. He directed this stream to a ledge in the wall, in the hope that his strong magic would break through this barrier that separated him from the outside world. "There are no more reasons to stay here," Yang said menacingly. "The current me will not be so easy to defeat even if the eggs are one of the 10 strongest Muram practitioners." You can say his dream came true, he became invincible. Thanks to the energy he released onto the wall, the cold stones succumbed to this and began to crackle disgustingly. I didn't understand that he did everything right, and in just a couple of minutes he would see the sun again, feel the cool wind on his face, hear birds singing, maybe even take a swim in the pond, because during all this time he had already forgotten what it was like to take a shower. The exit from the cave was ordinary. Nothing remarkable. What caves are there in all the mountains, and they are mostly abandoned, like this one? A strong flow of energy, all the stones that were inside the fireplace rooms flew out with a whistle. I could finally remember what it was like to come out into the world. He stood calmly and concentrated his energy further. His right hand was extended towards the door, which he finally broke through. The bright light blinded him, so he was in a dark room for a very long time. His eyes began to sting, so he quickly covered them with his hand. This continued until his eyes got used to the street light again. "The familiar light is blinding," the guy said, moving towards the exit into nature. On the street, he raised his head to the heavens. The blue sky again stretched out in front, which was hidden in the dense branches of trees familiar to him. He could not get enough of this format, since he had not been in the wild for a very long time. His eyes and he himself have already become accustomed to daylight. He just stood there and enjoyed the gusts of wind that blew across his skin. He listened to the birds singing and a feeling of calm. His pleasure was interrupted by a strange sound. He opened his eyes and began to look around. A strange man was sitting near the tree in front of him. His hands lay on his lap and his hair was braided into a tight hairstyle at the back of his head. From the sounds he made, it was clear that he was sleeping. Yang, without thinking twice, approached him and began to gently shake him so that he would wake up. "Let me ask," the guy said calmly and sweetly at the same time. He knelt down next to the man. The strange figure in front of the warrior's eyes began to gradually wake up. "I don't understand what is happening around him." He slowly raised his hand with his index finger, but could not say anything yet, since the kingdom of Morpheus had not yet released him. The man finally opened his eyes. Seeing Ian in a new guise, he was scared. In front of him stood a huge 2-meter guy, with light stubble and surprise on his face. The man immediately broke out in a cold sweat. Why the guy still didn't understand. The man screamed loudly and began to refuse Ian. He pointed his finger at it, shook his legs and his head. The warrior still did not understand what was happening and why this villager was afraid of him. The man began to make strange sounds and could not put his words together. He simply pointed his finger at him and continued to scream. I thought with surprise on my face, "Huh? Mute or what? Just think how long after I met the man, he turned out to be mute. The guy also stood in a kind of shock, he didn't believe in his luck. A few minutes later he created with himself and asked the man a question. You can't talk? The guy calmly asked the question, holding his head. After this question, the man began to fear Ian even more. It seems the old owner of the body was not so kind to the locals. The man, without thinking twice, fell to his knees and began screaming, I committed an unforgivable sin. Ask. Ian stood in shock. He didn't understand what was happening and why this strange man was apologizing to him on his knees. What's going on here? A rhetorical question that still has no answer. Please have mercy. The man continued to shout. I started to think to myself, oh, he probably mistook me for a bandit. I really don't look good. After these thoughts, he calmly, but at the same time in surprise, asked this old man a question. Calm down, why should I see you? I'm not what you think. He stretched out the man's hand to calm him down. With his hand on his shoulder, he always reassured his students and guided them to the right path. Now this movement did not work, the man screamed loudly and again began to speak in hysterics. Oh, are you going to send me into the corridors of 10,000 demons? He shouted, waving his arms and head from side to side. No, please, better kill me. The strange man did not calm down, on the contrary, he became even more hysterical. He began to bow at Ian's feet, smashing his head on the ground. Ian couldn't stand this sight, ran up to the man, picked him up and said, What are you doing? Get up! The warrior said, rubbing the man's shoulders. This movement of Ian frightened the man even more. He looked at him with eyes full of horror and simply opened his mouth. Literally a couple of minutes later, as fear gripped his body, the man started foaming at the mouth and tears flowed from his eyes. He fainted right in Jan's arms, which surprised him even more. The warrior carefully placed him under a tree in the shade, quietly and carefully saying, What a timid man. Still remaining in a state of surprise, the guy said, Sorry for scaring you, but I have to go. Let's leave the man in this state. I moved deeper into the forest, wondering why he had so scared an ordinary villager. The warrior still moved through the forest, lifting the tree branches that interfered with him. Literally an hour later, his journey through the wilds of the forest, he came to the village. This picture made him very happy, so he was looking specifically for the local civilization. The village was huge, a stone wall surrounded it in a circle. In the center of the village stood two tall towers, in the center of which was a room that vaguely reminded him of the residence of the head teacher in his past life. He was delighted and very quickly went down the steps that led to the bottom, the entrance to this town. There were 3 guards standing in front of the gate. 2 of them were tall and muscular, and the third was small and thin. They all had a long sword with them, which they held in their hands. One of them immediately noticed Ian and watched him go down the steps with a question in his eyes. He pointed his finger towards the descent from the forest to his fellow shift workers. Their gaze immediately showed bias towards this person. Usually, either a wanderer or a potential danger came out of the forest in such clothes. Jan calmly stopped in front of them. His face showed only the seriousness of his intentions. He calmly looked at each of the warriors, who seemed to already suspect reinforcements. Coming closer, the warrior felt their internal energy. Closing his eyes and opening them again, he saw that each of the guards at the doors to the city had equal strength. This could also be seen because their eyes glowed the same color. Yang inhaled and exhaled and was surprised, very strong energy emanates from them. And such warriors are simply guarding the entrance. What kind of place is this? The city guards began to move towards Yang. They walked calmly, keeping their swords with them, and most importantly, they drove them. I briefly thought that they were approaching him, which meant I would have to fight. This is not the first time he has had to save his life, but 4 against 1 is too much. But the guards, in order to attack and injure the warrior's new body, simply knelt down and loudly shouted my master in one voice, bowing their heads before Ian's feet. The guy just stood there in invisible shock. Each of the warriors shouted congratulations in unison on completing their training. He didn't understand what was happening and how all these people knew him. Well, so far they know no less new bodies. Ian still stood still and did not move. He was greatly surprised by the young master's phrase. Without thinking twice, he looked at the sign that hung at the entrance to the city. It said Guanman Cult. Astonishment. The only thing that could be seen on the warrior's face was surprise. Guanmian cult? Before him, it was something in the realm of science fiction. This place is hidden among countless centuries-old and majestic mountains. It's not that easy to find. It is also a place that you can't just leave once you set foot on its territory. Most people thought it was fictitious, including Yang. He had heard legends about it, but never believed its existence. Now his face took on an even more surprised look, since strangers called this city a demonic cult, since the people of this city possess strange arts and magic. The warriors who showed respect called me young master. The surprise in his eyes was blurred by Yang. This means the master of the body. How is this possible? The son of the head of the Nurang Union is obliged to strive for justice. Now he is the young master of the demonic cult. Ian never ceased to be amazed. He quickly ran past the soldiers forward into the city. They surprisingly asked what was happening and looked at him dumbfounded. He grabs his body, trying to stop the trembling, repeating to himself, then the technology that was studied in the cave, are they really? He was distracted from his thoughts by a rhetorical question from one of the warriors. Then if the young master has completed his training, does that mean that you have mastered the supreme art of the demon lord? After this question, all the other warriors began to look at the young master with desire in their eyes. The warrior heard this and was even more surprised. He has been studying the power of the demon lord all this time, the righteous and honest one. How is this possible? Not long ago, he swore that he would use this power only with good intentions, but now it turns out that it was all pointless. He tried to keep his emotions in check, but his thoughts were doing something completely different. The creator of the art that I studied for several years, the person I paid for and swore to serve as my true master, belongs to a demonic cult and is a demon lord? He couldn't stand it and grabbed one warrior, namely the one who asked this question, by the collar and started shouting no. He was unable to comprehend the seriousness of the situation, so he let his emotions rise, surprising the rest of the warriors. The warrior still continued to shout no, but this time he couldn't hold back his tears. He still held this young warrior by the collar and shouted that this was not true. You were seriously scared of him and his comrades. The young guys tried to calm him down, pulling him away from the brave man's body. Still, they succeeded. He let the guy go and fully gave vent to his emotions. Salty drops ran down his face, reaching his shirt and hair. He repeated who he was and who he was. He repeated in his head that he had mastered the supreme art of the demon lord of the Guanman cult. He couldn't stand the amount of new information about himself, and he fell in a painful faint right into the arms of his students. Ian woke up already in the room, spacious and bright. The bed was wide and long, and the sticks that surrounded it were thin and filled with various vases from eras that had passed a long time ago. The warrior stood up and asked himself, was that a dream? Rubbing his head and talking to himself, he looked around the room and saw a plate with falling water. Probably Dana's servants had long ago brought a plate of water so that he could finally wash himself after a long time. He scooped up water with his thin palms and brought them to his face. For the first time in a long time, he felt physical pleasure. He liked to feel the water on his face, touching his skin with rough fingers. His calm did not last long. As soon as he removed his hand from his face, he noticed his reflection in the mirror. The boy realized that this was not a dream at all. Everything that happened to him was reality. He really was reborn into a magical creature, mastered the art of demons and was considered the main one in this village. Young master! Without thinking twice, he shouted at the top of his voice, no, this is not a dream. Tears welled up in his eyes as his last hopes were dashed. He quickly puts the whole thing in a plate of water, hoping that he will be able to wash away this grim and return to his old appearance. But we all understood that this was pointless. The rebirth could not be cancelled and it could not be returned back to his real body. Why do I need this punishment? Ian was the only thing he could squeeze out this time, still with his face in a bowl of water. At this time, completely different things were happening in the dark palace. A tall building resembling a temple stood right in the center of the town. One might say it was its center, where ordinary mortal residents were afraid to enter without an invitation. Let's take it higher. They were afraid to go ahead with their proposal. A princess was sitting in the palace. She was the second daughter of the second demon Dan Zhonghak. She had long brown hair that was braided into two tight horns at the back of her head. A servant always worked near her, who constantly monitored her appearance. She was always dressed in a gray dress with signs of such dark colors. She was in a state of some kind of bewilderment or worry. Seeing this, the servant said, "Miss, relax your face, otherwise you will get wrinkles." Hearing this, the girl began to scream, "Do you think I should smile now? You better tell me when this bastard came back." The thing to calm her down was to start combing her long hair. Because the princess was twitching, it caused her pain. And for literally 10 minutes he repeated, "Don't jerk," every time. It's been 3 years since he left. Why did he decide to return? The long-haired princess did not reassure. "I personally wanted him to die there." She held her small fist near her chest. Her words greatly surprised the service, so she said, "Miss, don't say that quietly. What if someone hears you? Then it will be bad for both of them." The servant's words angered the princess even more, as she was proud and too confident in her capabilities and title. "Who else could be here besides us?" Gave in to a more rhetorical question, "Is it really real? Who would dare to overhear? Even if they hear, what difference does it make? I really want him to just die." The servant, realizing that the princess could no longer restrain her aggression, began to speak further. "But you were supposed to become his future wife. You shouldn't put it that way." The princess, without hiding her direct aggression, turned her head towards the woman. I still feel this pain in her hair that she wore to herself. The servant saw this and continued his conversation. "Oh, but," he returned, "I thought you would end your days alone. As it turned out, this woman is not the princess's servant, she is her nanny." The princess continued to twitch, thereby pulling all the hairs on the comb. The nanny understood that she would no longer be able to calm the princess. So she just silently continued to comb her long hair. Realizing the whole problematic situation, the woman added, "It seems I've lost my tact, ha." Having calmed down, the princess began to talk with her nanny about a more important topic, the supreme art of the demon lord. Even the head himself couldn't master it, didn't expect him to be able to. I heard he started crying and fainted. The princess said to her nanny with some malice. The woman calmly answered her, "Things must not have gone as he planned. Try to understand him and don't pay attention to others." Looking carefully at this woman, we can say that she is 40 to 50 years old. She always has her hair neatly taped up and wears baggy clothes. Basically, like all the servants who serve the royal families. And then the princess started screaming again, "Why should I? He has achieved nothing and is simply using his status as a young master to have fun with other women." The girl stomped her feet, waved her arms and turned her head over and over again. You could say this is her peculiarity of presenting aggression. Yes, I'm not so used to all this that I simply don't notice it or just remain silent. In order to somehow calm the princess down or distract her from an outburst of aggression, she put her hand on her cheek and closed her eyes and said, "Well, he's handsome." The princess turned her head towards her in bewilderment. The only thing she could squeeze out was the question, what? She knew he was handsome, but she would never have said that in her life. Pride wouldn't allow it. The nanny didn't stop. She continued to say, "Don't you want to forgive him everything, looking at such a sweet face?" We can say that she was very much daydreaming or simply wanted happiness for her pupil. The princess at this time simply looked at her carefully, suppressing her aggression and thinking about the subsequent meeting with the new Yang, who now bore the title of young master. After finishing the procedure with her hair, the princess thought about it. One phrase had been spinning in her head for a very long time. "I can't believe that I thought the same thing a couple of years ago." She began to remember everything that happened to her and everything that concerned Ian. "My naive fantasies were dashed even at our first meeting, but," she said to herself. She remembered how they walked with the streets of the city and reached the young master's house. She watched as he sat on the veranda using strange magic. The sight was unusual, so she couldn't look away. It turns out he was just sitting. Usually he meditates like this or ponders some important action. That day he was dressed in a white kimono and a robe of the same color. The only difference was that the robe was dotted with patterns. His black hair twisted in the wind, his sharp nose emphasized the thinness of his body and face. The long neck sparkled in the moonlight. The girl immediately fell in love. His appearance attracted her, and his great height only consumed this situation. She came closer to him and asked, "You are a young master, right?" The guy slowly turned his head and saw her. A small and petite girl stood in front of him. And her hair was beautifully styled, and her palms were hidden in the wide sleeves of her dress. He looked at her carefully. She couldn't stand this look, closed her eyes and said, "My name is Dan Yewa." The young master immediately understood who he was talking about. "Oh, so you are my bride. Well, you don't look as bad as I imagined," he said in a satisfied voice. Then he did something that forever discouraged the girl from wanting to communicate with him normally. "Come on, massage my legs," he said, which put her in a stupor. She decided to pretend that she didn't hear him and asked, "Sorry?" The young master immediately smiled sarcastically. "Oh, I can't charm you, can I?" His facial expression did not bode well. It seems that he had a plan in mind a long time ago, since he did not intend to get married so early. He sharply turned his eyes to fiery red ones and raised his hand pointing it at the girl. He began to speak in a voice that only demons usually speak. "Don't worry, I'll massage you too. Let's join our bodies together." At that time, the young master was only 15 years old, childhood had not yet left his body. The girls were 14. The princess loudly shouted the phrase "and I'm 14, which scared her nanny to the point of gray hair. She continued her monologue. Does he really think that the supreme art of the demon lord is just another joke? His ancestors gave their lives trying to master these techniques. True, I even wanted to applaud him when he decided to lock himself in the corridor of higher demons. Everyone hated him so much that no one stopped him. Dan continued to scream, looking at herself in the mirror. During this time, the nanny was collecting something on the floor, completely agreeing with her teacher. If he had taken an oath that he mastered this art, he would have had to give up his life if he had not succeeded. Why would he crawl out of the cave in tears after 3 years? The princess continued to scream and be indignant. She, sitting with tears in her eyes, continued to conduct a monologue with the nanny and herself. "And I am the one who is called the ice flower. Why do I have to marry a moron like him? Yes, I'd rather die." The girl no longer expressed her emotions. The first meeting with the young gentleman spoiled any impression of him. Because of this she will never agree to this marriage again, although she has no choice. Dan began screaming even louder, banging her fists on the table, and shaking her legs. The nanny said with a calm face, "Miss made a mistake, small Myung Palace? Who knows? Maybe these 3 years have changed him. And now he will behave completely differently with you." Despite all the persuasion and reflections of the nanny, the princess was not convinced. She still continued to scream, causing the woman to cover her ears with her hands. She had already agreed not to say anything and simply silently picked up clean things and left the princess's room. The girl, in turn, remained sitting near the small table and looking at her reflection in the mirror. Dan still continued to sit at the table. She tried to gather all her strength into a fist and finally meet the young master halfway. After all, he is still her fiancé. From these thoughts she again had an attack of aggression, and she hit the table with her small fist as hard as she could. Because of this, all the things that were standing on the old people jumped to the top. She stood up and looked out the window, straight to where the small palace stood. She's a princess. This means she must fulfill her duty. All this time, the new Yang sat and thought. He had a lot of questions, but very few answers. Being alone, he spoke. "It's been 4 days since I regained consciousness," he began, without lowering the lock from his hands below his face. "Only a few people came to visit me, even though I'm a young master. But in this short time I learned something." He nevertheless removed his hands from his face in order to completely contain it in the mirror, and continued his monologue. "Firstly, the owner of this body is the small head of the Myung cult, Ta Chongcho. If you believe people, his behavior was not the best." He looked away from his reflection in the mirror and continued his story. "No. She was simply unacceptable." After which he again turned his head and his reflection, examining it, studying every little thing that his own eye could catch. The locals call him a petty lust, a lustful spirit. He also heard from the locals a story about what he did in a past life. It turns out he had a lot of fun with women. He also uses his status to remain unpunished and act worse than an evil spirit. Local residents are afraid of him and consider him crazy. Yes, this particular word is appropriate, because wherever the young master goes, there will be fighting and destruction. I didn't expect much, since this is a demonic cult, but, if I think about it, I came across the worst option. Ian was thinking again, and, secondly, I found out why he could remain untouched for everything that he did. His father is the head of a demonic cult, one of those supreme beings that surpasses even the 10 landmasters. Therefore, the young master behaved disgustingly and suffered this punishment.
Demon Ma Teppan. What was his father's name?
Great and terrifying, but at the same time fair.
Am I happy that I can call one of the strongest people on earth my father? Yang asked himself sarcastically, putting his hand to his face.
He was still sitting at that table, moving only his hands and turning his head now to the right, now to the left. Also, the young master, that is, Yang's new body, learned that he is the only son of the head with such a status, just a pitiful empty shell. It is unknown whether the owner of the body was indifferent to everything or just a fool. But he lived his life and a drop of effort, the voice thought young. Even though he had studied martial techniques, the young master was not that good at them. 8 social skills could be called insignificant. The only thing he had as a guest was the Myong small palace.
New young master.
So to speak, I heard the conversation of those passing by. And if he is honest with himself, such a dialogue was not entirely pleasant for him.
One girl said to another, "Is it possible now, young master, for me to fly a kite without a rope?"
Since he failed to fully master the supreme art of the demon lord, the head cannot leave him alone when he returns.
Another girl answered without indignation,
"To be honest, the next head of the Myung cult should be Yuljin. It will be better for all of us." The second girl realized the whole problematic situation, what they were talking about, added in a harsh tone,
"Say that someone can hear you."
At this time, Ian, in a new guise, passed by and heard all this. He was sad to realize that his new body had nothing good in its life, and its bad reputation was affecting it. I shouldn't blame them too much. These are the words that the owner of the body, Ma Chongcho, should have heard, Yang thought. And he's right. Before the young master had time to stand up, he could already hear the discontent of the citizens. But these words stuck in his head. "A kite without a rope," the guy said thoughtfully. There wasn't a minute after he woke up that he didn't think about everything the owner of the business was doing. Even if Ma Chongcho was not destroyed by excess chi, he still would not have long to live. After these words, he looked again at his reflection in the mirror. He again carefully studied his new self. They did not believe that this could happen to him, the great warrior. After that, he stood up to his full height, without taking his eyes off the mirror with its reflection. He stood and looked at his hands. He spoke to himself over and over again. The only thing that is encouraging about such a moment. He is only 19 and only 3 years have passed since his death. This time he moved closer to the mirror. He looked at everything at once. Now his eyebrows are very thin, but thick, his lips have become even narrower, and his face has become thin. His hair remained the same length as it was, most likely only because he had not seen white light for 3 years. At one point, he suddenly changed his face, realizing one small thing. I guess. Even if I return to the Neuron Union, who looked at my appearance and who would even decide to say hello? It would be extremely surprising to manage to preserve your own life story. He spread his hands over the table, feeling a heavy surge of fatigue. He understood everything perfectly well, that he could never return his past life. Having spent the last days like a madman, I have no strength left to be angry, the young gentleman diagnosed himself. In an instant, he began to wash himself abruptly. He filled his hands with water again and again, bringing it to his face, as if he was trying to wash this whole situation off his body. He didn't need this at all, but for some reason the universe decided everything for him. He raised and lowered his head. He tried to return to his previous life, but to no avail. He rubbed his face, pulled his hair, fixed his ears, did nothing in this situation. It was clear even to the fool that he would not return his past life. Finally, after just a couple of minutes, he pulled himself together. It's not like me to worry about something that's already happened. His face took on a serious look, the lighter on his temple began to play its march. Now I must accept this, a proud and domineering body, as the real owner of the body, said Yang. He still looked at himself in the reflection of the mirror, repeating the name he now bears. Finally remaining, he said, it doesn't matter how you lived. I will live in my own way as Jan Kagak. And then suddenly he noticed the strange behavior of his reflection. At the moment of these words he did not smile, he did not even blink. But for some reason his reflection was with a deep and crazy smile. Suddenly she began to move towards Ian. She looked at him strangely, his eyes really became crazy. The living reflection turned to Ian with the words, "Do a great job." I stood in utter horror. As a warrior, it was not appropriate for him to be afraid, but this situation seriously frightened him. The reflection further said only the beginning is distorted. It's still a demonic cult. Nothing will work here just like that. And you are the young master in this world, Ma Chancho. The monster in the mirror began to change. His arms became longer, his head became like a fireball only in purple shades. The substance began to emerge from the mirror and move towards our warrior. Despite all the horror that Ian was now experiencing, he did not move a single step. He expected what would happen next. The monster didn't do anything wrong. It started speaking again. I will watch you. Let's see how you cope with all the upcoming problems. Yang stood motionless and could not take his eyes off the creature that had previously been his reflection. In an instant the creature disappeared. The young master heard a strange sound. Not even a minute had passed before he realized that the doors had simply opened. He was a little afraid to turn around and see the creature that was just in front of him, but this must be done anyway, since he acts as a fearless and strong son of the devil. He turned sharply towards the doors. This time, what stood in front of them was not a scary purple monster, but a beautiful petite girl. At this time, the princess did not look directly into the eyes of the young master. The residue from the first meeting still hovered in her soul. I didn't come up with anything smarter, I just asked who. There was a decent distance in front of them, but he was still able to see her beautiful and sophisticated face. He once again repeated his question from before. At first Dan thought that he was just joking, but each time she realized that this was not a joke and her patience began to fail. She could not withstand this onslaught and was dissatisfied with her arrival. She asked menacingly and ironically, who? I didn't understand what was happening and who this girl was. It was generally unclear to him what he continued to do here and how he behaved, like Yang from a past life or like Ma from this life. Now he could better examine the girl who stood in front of him. She looked straight at him. In terms of age, she was about 17 to 18 years old. Her long dark hair fell over her shoulders. The eyes are dark and expressive, the street is oval with clear contours. The lips are a little thin, but at the same time expressive, and for me the non-black nose flows smoothly into the forehead. For the first time in his life, our warrior felt embarrassed. While he was studying various martial arts, he occasionally saw girls. And now a beautiful and at first sight rich beauty stands in front of him and looks straight into his eyes. And then he realized that he needed to say something. A lot of thoughts were running through my head, but they didn't reach a common denominator. He shouted out all the possible outcomes of events, but could not choose one of them. He began to remember how his new body behaves in this world. I shouldn't speak so politely while in this body, the young master nevertheless concluded to himself. He also concluded that it is very difficult to get rid of habits, especially if they are good ones. He still looked intently at the girl in front of him. I don't think long, putting his hand to his lips, he said. No, he asked. Who the hell are you? These words were very difficult for him, because he had never allowed himself to talk like that. At this moment, the princess was even more dumbfounded. She knew the habits of the young master and his manner of communication, but for something like this. Still, 3 years changed him for the worse. He doesn't even recognize people now. She couldn't stand it and screamed loudly. Have you already forgotten my face? Her right hand lay on her chest, where her heart beat rhythmically. Ian was surprised. If she allows you to communicate with the young master like this, then they are close. If they are close enough for it to be so special for the young master to just sit in peace, then this is not their first meeting. Yang confirmed his own words in his thoughts. He looked at the girl again. It seemed to him that the clothes were not ordinary and the shoes were too simple and comfortable. Having made such conclusions, he thought, a young girl who can, if she wishes, enter the little Mayan palace. He made the most correct conclusion in his opinion. She is my maid. He decided to get out of the situation by saying, I'm deep in thought. He tried to stand with an unwavering face, which was difficult for him. The only thing he could squeeze out was, I'll go away, you can start your work. It was reckless on his part, because he didn't know the person to say such a thing. Dan was outraged to the core. She started shouting loudly, what are you talking about? And in general, what do you allow yourself? Ian was surprised. Either he made a big mistake about this person, or the girl is very obstinate and therefore is now snapping at him. His surprised face confused the princess even more. Probably because he was talking to her in all seriousness. In this situation, I decided to get out of it with a ruder and more authoritative voice, offensive phrases, and barbs.
Is it really a simple servant asking me what to do? Are you not a timid person, or are you just stupid?
After all, Yen manages to be like Ma, but it's difficult for him to achieve this.
The princess became even more furious. I've never achieved this before, but now. It's simply unthinkable.
The former warrior continued his organ.
In any case, you are wrong.
Apologize and get to work.
And I forgot to add one more thing and get lost.
Princess Dan was already seriously angry. She curled her small hands into fists, and her pose certainly did not resemble graceful. She stood like a real warrior or hunter.
Ma, no matter how funny it may sound, continued to talk. It's your job, don't forget about it.
To these words he added a body movement with his right hand, which resembled the swing of a king. The princess began to speak, trying to control herself.
You just called me a simple servant?
Her body posture has not changed. Her legs spread wide gave the impression that she was ready to rush at the young master and slap him with the words he said. Yang did not understand such a reaction from his maid. He tried not to stray from the personality of the most inveterate robber of the city, but still there was something he didn't like about this lady.
Maybe it was with her that the son of the devil behaved appropriately? Or maybe it's his love.
Ian still didn't know the answers to this question, so he continued to play his role. I shouldn't be biased towards people based only on their work, but... Sorry, he thought to himself, killing this dialogue did not bring him pleasure either. He turned again to the mirror, where literally 5 minutes ago he saw a monster instead of his own reflection.
You can tell the real identity of his new body. And then it appeared before his eyes again.
Everything is purple in color, with long arms and sharp nails. She told him that this was all a demonic cult, he couldn't escape it and he wouldn't be able to correct his personality. These words were spoken only to him and only he heard them. Because of all this, the base began to be angry with himself, to find people who sent his real identity, and to be angry with his past life in general.
Is there something wrong?
As the owner of the Lion Parachute, I will fulfill your duties, Yang insisted. He continued to pretend to be a young master, bloodthirsty and unhappy. He turned his head to the girl and began to say,
So you don't have, well, I couldn't finish the phrase I was going to say. Turning around, she saw a heartbreaking picture.
The girl, whom he considered a servant, stood in front of him and cried. Tears covered her thin and pale face, her eyes began to shine even more. The lips curved into the painful smile he had immediately seen earlier. And then he finally felt remorse. His words were overcome by a strange stupor. He didn't understand what was happening, why this young beautiful girl was crying in front of him. After all, the maids are accustomed to such treatment from their masters.
Oh, was I too rude?
The warrior thought in his head, looking at the princess in tears.
Now she was no longer angry or screaming.
She was in so much pain and discomfort that she simply remained silent. Not even a minute had passed before she turned around and sharply headed towards the exit. The guy was confused because he didn't understand what he had done wrong. He, being angry and insensitive, should also communicate with people, especially maids and servants. He wanted to stop the girl, but did not have time. She walked to the door and left the palace, and the edge slammed the door behind her. This movement brought all the pain and resentment and contempt for this person. The warriors, in turn, winced at the loud sound of the closing door.
The princess walked back to her palace, wiping the tears from her heavenly eyes along the way. Bastard! They want me to marry someone like him?
She quickly left the palace, which brought so many unpleasant memories. Her dress fluttered in the wind, and the pendant from her neck resembled a lighthouse, moving now to the right, now to the left.
No, I'd rather die. She told herself about marrying Ma.
She understood that they would change, but only to become even worse. All hopes and dreams were crushed.
Ian stood in bewilderment all this time.
I still didn't understand what I did wrong, so I came to the conclusion only to myself. Apparently even the servants of this cult are quite impulsive.
After 2 minutes, his stomach made a peculiar sound.
This can be called a signal of a hungry stomach, so he grabbed his stomach and simply closed his eyes, hoping that it would pass quickly. He doesn't know the city or where to eat. I don't really have any friends who can take him or bring him food to his room. The warrior stood further and thought about his actions. Didn't I let her go too quickly?
I actually should have ordered her to do something. Yes, that's exactly what the old owner of his body would have done.
No, get yourself together. First we need to find out the circumstances of the matter. Yang began talking to himself again. He has recently been in a new body, but still cannot get used to it and the problems that await him or already exist.
The warrior decided to go out into the world.
He carefully and quietly opened the door and saw the sun, which not so long ago began to shine in the sky. He quickly went to the side where he could fully examine and enjoy his possessions. Well, what's his name? The possessions of his new body. He began to look around, again thinking, so he is almost the only one who lives in this entire small palace of men. The surprise still did not leave his face, although he already realized that the old gentleman was not very loved by people. And after today's situation, also girls. He went to one of the rooms of his potential servants.
He calmly entered the room and asked, "Are you here?"
Before his eyes was a small bed behind a very thin screen. A guy quickly appeared behind her.
Without thinking twice, he answered and began asking questions. "Young master, what brings you here at this hour?"
The guy introduced himself as Yultak.
He was short and thin.
His hair was short, but still tied up in a hairstyle. He quickly threw on his poor and dark robe, without taking his eyes off his owner. "I am a courtier of the Myong small palace."
Yultak, mister. He was the only servant and the only person who visited Yang in the last 4 days.
Currently, it is the two of them who live in this damn palace. The boy came closer to the young master and said,
"Today you called me by name. Memories come back, right?"
Yang looked at him carefully and listened. The servant did not stop saying,
"When you returned you looked a bit gloomy, so I was worried. All because he lacks negative energy, right?"
In the world, negative energy is the energy of the moon and women, and positive energy is the energy of the sun and men. The servant approached the young master and put his hand on his shoulders asking a question.
"Can't book a place in a brothel?
They say that garbage is attracted to garbage."
"How can he be so vicious?" said the warrior. "Thank you." He was still surprised by the lifestyle of his new body.
After all, he never used prodigal women and never intended to.
A little irritated, Ian began to speak. "Stop this nonsense. Let me ask a few questions as my memory has not fully returned yet."
On Saturday he was very surprised, because there was not a day when his master did not visit brothels. It was an integral part of his life. So he chuckled weakly. In just 2 seconds he put his hand to his master's forehead.
He probably thinks he's sick.
It was unthinkable to miss another visit to the brothel.
Ian was very surprised and asked in a trembling voice, "What are you doing?" His mouth was in bewilderment and his eyes were running from side to side.
The servant, still holding his hand on his master's forehead, said,
"Strangely, there seems to be no temperature." Seeing the confusion on the master's face, the servant added,
"Speak as if you are a person of a traditional cult." The boy still continued to keep his hand on the master's forehead. "I've been looking at him strangely all this time. I don't understand what's wrong with this." At one point he abruptly threw off his hand and shouted,
"Nonsense!"
And then it dawned on Jan, it was in this situation that his servant, who carried away his new body, could suspect that his young master was not at all the person he claims to be.
"What should I do?" he thought.
He began to think whether he should kill him or whether he should get out of here as soon as possible. From these thoughts, energy began to flow into my hand. It is the wall of the stone room that he studied during his 3 years of stay.
The servant just smiled stupidly all the time.
Noticing the confusion in his master's eyes, he laughed loudly and said,
"Yes, I'm kidding, you were so surprised. Now you want to be a good guy? I remember how different your behavior was."
Withstood this moral onslaught, Ian hit his forehead with his fist. The servant tried to get out of the situation by saying, "I am a busy man, but I must follow the orders of my master." He spoke these words to the man who was knocking on the door.
Ian will not get out of this nonsense and said, "Do you call someone who sleeps in broad daylight busy?
At least wipe the drool off your cheek." Having received a tasty kick, the servant asked,
"So what? What did you want to ask me?"
he asked, rubbing the back of his head. Jan, without thinking twice looking at the flowers in the vases, asked,
"Care for flowers?"
The servant, instead of the normal answer, asked,
"Why do you want to tease me again?"
His face became surprised. He saw his young master touching the leaves of fresh flowers.
Ian, lost in thought, began to say,
Looking at these twisting soft leaves, you might think that this is how nature greets me. Smells nice. A contented, calm smile appeared on his face. He liked all living things. Yultak was extremely surprised. I have never seen his master behave so calmly and nicely with the world around him. Ian continued to touch the flowers and enjoy the softness of the long green leaves. And the flowering stem reminded him of his home. The servant could not stand it and asked him a question. Are you sure, young master? Did you accidentally hit your head? Ian realized his little mistake. But he wasn't going to take his words back. He simply asked him a question, still not letting go of the piece of paper. And how did I talk about this earlier? Usually, my questions are a favor. He remembered how his master usually answered him with such phrases. Hey, you fucking piece of spoiled tofu, if you say that again I'll cut your damn tongue into 5 pieces. For some reason, Yang was not surprised. The original is that the old owner of his body was aggressive and inhumane. The servant, seeing his look, quickly asked, why are you looking at me like that? Actually, you were one of the worst. It is normal for a representative of a demonic cult to express himself cruelly. Yang, clutching his head, said, ha, okay. Tell me better how the cult is organized. This question completely confused his servant. Ian himself realized that the question was very innocent to me. The servant said with a strange crazy smile, it was loud. I told you to have something to eat. Let's go in and eat and we'll talk. Ian was surprised, but he didn't want to refuse food, because his guts were playing the third march of a symphony unknown to him. Remember the Menchun restaurant? A dish of meat with white garlic. They prepare it from a recently caught pig, cut the carcass into pieces and after boiling it melts in your mouth. Yang, listening to his servant, licked his lips and asked, meat with white garlic? The servant continued to tease his appetite. Do you think that's all? After a bowl of rice soup with egg yolk and southern corn, it feels so warm inside. The servant said, rubbing his stomach. Yang quickly found herself behind the servant and pushed him towards the door with the words let's go. He transferred all responsibility for food to the service, although he himself was hungry. He agreed weakly and quickly led his master to the restaurant. But then the servant stopped abruptly and said with a sad face, I remembered that the Menchun restaurant is closed today. I suggest you eat somewhere else. Ian shouted out the question why. He was terribly hungry, pushkin more after the stories of his servant. The guy began his story about why the restaurant was not working. Today there will be a meeting of the heirs of the Mayong cult. A meeting of the heirs of the Mayong cult? Yang asked with surprise in his voice. Yes, today all the children of significant representatives of the clan are gathering there. Yuljin answered calmly. Seeing the interest on his young master's face, he quickly added, I strongly recommend not to go there. But Ian was no longer listening. The phrase stuck in his head, all the heirs of the Mayong cult.